Welcome everyone to Long Beach City College. Anyone go to Long Beach City College? Or is going to Long Beach City College? It's a little different than when I was here in 2000. It took me a while to even find it myself, this spot. This was just a giant parking lot, 5-10 years ago. So I'm glad you guys are here. My name is Scott Jones. I'm the executive director of We Love Long Beach. And we've been communicating with Cormac for about 3 months now, and here we are today. So I'm glad you guys are with us. Little background of We Love Long Beach. We started We Love Long Beach 10 years ago, coming up March 22nd. My sister and I had lived in our Belmont Shore neighborhood for about 25 years, or 28 years. And we were talking and we were like, we don't really know all our neighbors on our block. And so we asked, what could we do? Well, let's do a breakfast on a Saturday. So we ended up creating a flyer, and I ended up going door to door, nervous as can be, knocking on doors of people that I've never ever thought or imagined that I was going to be connected with. After doing that Saturday, around 50 neighbors showed up to our house. We have a little park right off our house called Livingston Park. And we ate together, we had conversations. Most people stayed to the very end. And one lady came up at the end of it. She lived in the city of Downey. She said, "Thank you so much for doing this. This is what it was like when I was a child." So the next month we hosted another breakfast. 100 people showed up. We hosted a barbecue a few months later in our park. 500 people showed up. And what we learned in that moment was people really long to be connected. People long to belong. And from that point on, here we are 10 years later. The stickers at your table, it's about connection. Our nonprofit is about neighborliness. It's about creating connections with our neighbors. And what we believe is when that happens, we begin to live in the society that I think all of us really long to live in. And it starts with relationships. And so part of what today is connecting with each other, building our own relationships, and then dreaming and imagining and reimagining what our place, our block, our neighborhood, our city and society could look like when we begin to talk to each other, get to know each other, and actually maybe love and care for each other as well. So a few thank yous. I want to thank Store and Save as one of our sponsors. Aquarium, where's the aquarium? Yeah, we have some aquarium in the Pacific. Long Beach City College. Janae can't be here, but we have Joy, one of the sociology professors. Thanks, Joy. And some of our students here so far. Raise your hand. Also, Farmers and Merchants Bank. Thank you to them. And Memorial Care as well. So we could not have done this for sure without our sponsors. Also want to acknowledge our 2 board members in the back. Christine Gibson, right here. And Gabby Cruz. And my assistant director, also sister, not wife, Robin Jones. You don't know how many times we've done that. It's kind of weird. Also wanted to acknowledge Jeff Evans. He's with Design Learning. He's traveling with Cormac right now. From what city in Ohio? Cleveland, Ohio. I always think of that Drew Carey show.
Cleveland rocks.
Yeah, Cleveland rocks. Also want to thank our board president, Adam Ferry. He's been in communication with Cormac and been super helpful in putting this event together. Food in the back. Feel free to eat and drink and be merry. And restrooms, if you go out this door along the side, it's going to be on your left over in this direction as well. Again, thank you for being.
Those doors are open and unlocked.
Those are locked?
No, they're unlocked.
Oh, they are?
Go out those doors.
Yeah, I mean, do what you want. There's an open door. On that note, I want to bring up Adam Ferry, our board president.
It is super exciting to see so many faces in here. Honestly, you try to put on an event and you want to do something that you feel like is really significant, and then you hope people show up. So I've been involved with We Love Long Beach for 9 years out of the 10 here, and it's something that early on, when I hung out with Scott and Robin, I was telling the story last night, but we're on a gondola ride, and we're with all of our friends, and Scott and Robin are sharing kind of like what they're starting to begin. And something just struck me in that moment that said, wow, this has a future. This is something that everybody can get behind and be a part of. So today is really about sort of the next step. If you guys have been with us, you know we do events. Maybe you've hosted those events or you've been a part of them. You've probably experienced that moment of either knocking on someone's door, that awkwardness, but you also maybe by the end of the time felt sort of how elating it is to meet somebody new, to get a hug from someone, and to actually feel that sense of connection and belonging, and it really does bring you together. So today, this weekend is really about that. Cormac is somebody who works around the world in 30 different sites around the world. He's from Dublin, Ireland. His breadth of experience, I think, is something that we will really get to benefit from. But one of the best things about him, and I think our time last night eating together over dinner, was realizing that there really isn't an us and a them. There's a we. When we say we love Long Beach, you guys are We Love Long Beach. It's not Scott and Robin, myself, or anybody else. That this is an opportunity for all of us to connect with each other. When you walk in this room, you have something to learn, you have something to give, and you have something to teach. So we're going to approach this weekend that way, and even these next couple hours together. So I'm going to invite Cormac up, and let's give him a round of applause.
I think we're good to go. I'm going to stand here for a few minutes and just set the scene, if that's okay, and then I'm going to move in here so we can connect with each other. It's lovely to be here. I mean, such an honor. And for me, this is a very, very special day. St. Patrick's Day is a very big day in our calendar. Every culture has a way, and you know the way of a culture by its ritual and how it celebrates. I've come to understand, nearly 50 years of celebrating St. Patrick's Day, that it has absolutely nothing to do with St. Patrick. If you've ever been involved in an Irish celebration around St. Patrick, it probably has a lot more to do with the spirit of a different kind. But the spirit will be strong in Dublin, Ireland, and I think all over the world. One of the things that strikes me about We Love Long Beach, and it's something that strikes me when I travel in Canada and in Australia too, is that this is not a new idea. You're standing on the shoulders of elders and the original owners of this land, who really understood what it meant to be deeply in love with each other and to be deeply in love with their land. And so it's an honor to be with people who remember their ancestry, their heritage, and you come from so many different experiences of what that's like to be in a culture and a relationship with each other where it's not just about me, and it's not just about my friends, and it's not just about my family and my colleagues, but there's something else called our neighbor. And that's really what we're here to think about and talk about these next couple of days. So I'd like to start by taking a little risk, or inviting you to take a risk. There's two questions I love to ask. And normally I invite people to discuss these questions much later on in a process. But before I share a keynote address with you, I'd like to offer these questions to your table, because I think actually we're ready. People come out on a Saturday morning and make a proclamation of love to their place. That's significant, and I think we should pay attention to that. Well, one of the few declarations of love I ever made was to my wife in St. Marcos Square when I proposed marriage to her. You guys are proposing marriage to the places you live and the people that you live with, falling in love with each other. So I thought these questions would be pretty easy for you. So there's two questions I'd like you to chat about at your tables, and let's see how this goes, just for a couple of minutes, just to get to know each other. And the two questions, you might want to write them down, but I think you'll remember them. They have a ring to them. So the first question I'd like you to share some thoughts with each other around is, share the good life you plan to find. Share the good life you plan to find. And the second question kind of rhymes. It's share the better world you plan to leave behind. So share the good life you plan to find, and share the good life, or the better world, excuse me, you plan to leave behind. Because I think this is really what we're trying to understand here. What is it that people are personally going to invest in their neighbours and in their neighbour? And that's about the good life. So share some thoughts about the good life you plan to find and the better world you plan to leave behind. And let's just take some minutes, maybe 5 minutes, to get to know each other that way, in a much more authentic and deep way than we'd normally do. Enjoy. Let me just check in with you, maybe 3 or 4 people. As you had that conversation, what struck you? What struck you particularly about the questions and the kind of conversation that you had? Any reflections? And if you could say who you are, that would be awesome.
My name is Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi. As we look at all these tables, everything looks so diverse, but there is a genuine core that we're all craving and we're here to create for ourselves. And whether it's leaving an inspiration to our kids on how to follow in our footsteps, or how we can pull together resources that we've lived around for years and do it better, we're here with that same purpose, and it pulls us together regardless of what we look like.
Beautiful. Thank you. Well said. Any other reflections on the questions or the conversation that they enabled? Any other thoughts?
I don't think that.
Can you say who you are? I think Diana?
Yes,
Diana.
name is Danisa. Hello, everyone.
Hi, welcome.
But for me, the thought of good life or planning my life is something new, and I'm kind of getting to the middle of my life, and I just lived for a long time, and things happened good for me, and that was great, and I put in work to make those things happen, but there was really not a lot of thought, I would say, or intentionality about some things, so trying to be intentional more, so that to me, that's kind of like the plan.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Beautiful. Thank you. Anybody? Please.
Well, I noticed that there were
Again, if you could say who you are. I guess most people know you, but...
Teresa.
Hi, Teresa.
There were no politics. Everybody just seemed to want to have a good life and a better life and push that forward for everyone else. There was no divisiveness about this or that. It was all good.
Beautiful. That's a really powerful insight. So it got past politics into something that we could all talk about, some common space. It's fantastic. I think one of the other things that's really important for myself and Jeff is that inviting you to occupy the space of honor first is really critical. We're guests in your conversation, so the idea isn't that we're hosting a keynote where we tell you what to do. That's certainly not the way we want to be in relationship over these next 2 days. But the incredible honor of being, a guest in your conversations, in your stories, and in your vision for your future. And I think that's really what we're here trying to better understand together. What happens when people show up in each other's lives And maybe they don't have, conversations like we had, but somewhere along the line, they get to talk about a shared vision, and they get to feel productive and powerful together in a way that isn't about politics and isn't divisive. That's what we're trying to understand. And I think we'll have a long journey. I don't think that there is a particular insight that will send us on our way. But I'd like to take some time to share what I am learning from other people. So the only thing I think that's probably a little bit different about me is I'm an itinerant storyteller. So I've had the honor and the privilege of traveling around the world, listening in on people's conversations as they talk about the good life they plan to find and the better world they plan to leave behind. I think that's pretty much it. So what I'm doing is reporting out to you what they've said to me and each other. And I think you'll hear huge resonance with what it is you're doing. Now this afternoon, what we really want to do is get away from keynotes and get into workshop and really begin to hear the stories about what's happening for you, maybe talk about the dilemmas and talk about some of the techniques and practices that are working and some others that we might try. That's the plan for the afternoon and tomorrow afternoon. But I'm excited to share these stories because, one of the things about stories is, I feel, that we are all creatures of narrative. Every conversation you have with a human being is at the beginning of a story, an end of a story, or in the middle of a story. And so it's powerful, I think. It's a powerful way for us to come together and be in relationship that isn't about hierarchy or patriarchy or politics. About a year and a half ago, I traveled with a colleague of mine through part of Australia, Western Australia. And we were traveling from Perth to the Wheat Belt, which is a kind of a rural part of Australia. Anybody ever been to Australia? Yeah? So anybody who's been knows that one of the features of the experience of driving on most highways in Australia is they go on for a long, long way. I mean, a very long way. And often they're as straight as an arrow, and there's not a lot to see often. So as you get into rural areas, you're hungering for some stimulation. You're praying for a kangaroo to jump out in front of your car just to keep you awake. But we were driving along, and one of the things that struck me as we were driving along was this sense of an endless fence. I could see this fence. It seemed like it was going on for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And I was traveling with a colleague of mine, Peter Kenyon. And Peter kind of laughed and he said, I actually said to him, this must be the longest fence in the world. And he laughed and he said, it is. It's called a rabbit-proof fence. And I find the story behind this is both instructive and humorous. Because the story goes that in 1903, there was an outbreak of myxomatosis, which is a disease that rabbits get. And so what they decided to do, because they wanted to, stop the spread of the disease, was to build this fence, the longest fence in the world. So between 1903 and 1904, they built this fence. And I kind of looked at Peter and I thought, I'm a bit confused here because best as I know, rabbits burrow under fences. And he kind of laughed, and I just thought to myself, this is a wonderful metaphor for what happens so often when we leave the solutions to the institutions to figure out top-down. Because I really believe that somebody, maybe who was running the Department of Fences, got this challenge, and they thought, well, I'm going to fix it. And they did what they always do. They built a fence. And I think that's a great challenge in community life, silos, where we build fences. And what's lovely about where we are and the relationships we have is they're not about building fences, they're about bringing fences down and building relationships. But I think it's a challenge for a lot of institutions too. How do we get out of our silos and not just do what we've always done? Silos are where smart people go to do dumb things. I bet you the guy who came up with the idea of the fence was the best fence builder in the world. He probably knew more about fences than anybody else in the world. But the difficulty is it didn't work. You know, the other thing that struck me as we were traveling through the wheat belt was so many of the villages and the small towns that we went through had a story. And the story was essentially the only way things are going to get better around here is if somebody from outside comes in and makes them better. And I kept thinking to myself, have you seen the fence lately? You know, there's a clue in there somewhere. But we traveled and we went through pretty much maybe 20, 30 of these small towns. And they all had the same story. We're a dying town economically, things are bad. And the only hope we have is if a big business comes in and locates here, or if the federal government rescues us. And then we got to a place called Coolin. And they had a different story. And the story that they were telling was a story about how change happens from inside out. They had this kind of idea that I think all eggs understand. That when you apply force to an egg from the outside, life ends. But when it's applied from inside out, life begins. So these folks were in the business of hatching. And I think that's exactly how community comes to be. We hatch it. It doesn't come from outside. We all have a dream, I think, somewhere in our childhood that, you know, Santa Claus will come and make things better, or the cavalry will come and save the day. But then we grow up or wake up and we begin to realize that's just not the way life works. And these folks in Coolin had really, really got that. 10 years previously to us arriving there, they said that wasn't the case. They had the same story as pretty much every town we'd been through. And one of their big challenge, and I think this really switched their thinking, was that their biggest export was their children. So their children were leaving. And one of the ideas that they came up with was to set up their own bank. They were one of the first community banks in Western Australia because they thought, well, you know, there's a lot we don't have and there's a lot we're losing. But one of the things we do have, even if we don't have enough of it, is money. How about we organize to make sure the money we have gets us where we want to go? How about we imagined, and they do this in Nebraska today, the Community Foundation of Nebraska have started a similar conversation where they've said to families that are losing their children to big cities and to big universities outside of Nebraska, if you've got 3 kids, imagine now you've got a 4th, and the 4th child is your neighborhood and the local economy of your neighborhood. And how about you set aside some resource, financial resource for that child, just like you would for the other 3? Odds on are that if you do that, and if your neighbors do that as well, you may have a credit union or a bank that will actually give you the resource needed to give your children an option as to stay or leave. And I think, you know, for different reasons people are motivated. These folks were motivated because they wanted their children to stay and they wanted their economy to prevail. This isn't liking me today. There we go. But it's a story that I would say that if you wanted to put a framework around it, is a story that we might call an asset-based community story. And the reason I think it is because they were using what they had to secure what they wanted. They'd found a way of creating a shared vision, and then they asked the question, what have we got around here, and how can we connect it more productively so that we can make our vision visible? And I think that's what you're doing. You're making the invisible resources visible. You're telling a new story. And you're weaving an alternative future. And that's the piece I want to honor. Because I think you could put words on this, like we could call it asset-based community development, but I think you've done a better job of naming it. You've called it We Love Long Beach. And to me, making it personal and making it about love, not just about assets, making it about connection, I think that puts the finger right on the pulse of what we're about. So I think John McKnight, the gentleman with the beard, and Jody Kretzmann would want to honor what you're doing as well. And I know they would because I was with John last week. Now, John has Irish in him, and he's got Scots in him. And he spent, when he was younger, he's 86 now, but when he was younger, he used to travel a lot more than he does now. And one of the places he used to love to go to was the west of Ireland. And in 1965, and he may have told this story to you before if he's been here, but in 1965, he was traveling in Ireland, and he was in Kerry, which is in the west of Ireland. I was raised not too far away from Kerry in a city called Limerick. But he was in Kerry, and he was interested in fishing. So he had his fishing rod, and he went into a small store, a small shop. Now, in 1965 in rural Ireland, anybody ever been to Ireland? Great. How many people have Irish blood of one kind or another? Great. Fantastic. So, happy St. Patrick's Day. And that's to everybody, by the way. You're all honorary Irish today. But he walks into this store with the fishing rod, and he says to the guy behind the counter, "Have you got any bait?" In a Chicago accent, I guess. And the Kerry man takes off his peak cap and kind of scratches his head. And he says, "Now, sonny," because John was a younger man, he said, "when you say bait, what exactly do you mean?" And John said, "Well, like worms." And he kind of smiled, and he put his peak cap back on again. He says, "Well, now, here's the thing. I think if you turn around the way you came in, and you walk back out that door, and you look to your left side and your right side, you will see white painted flagstones." He says, "I know they're there because I put them and I painted them myself. And I think if you lifted up one of those, you'd find all the bait you need." And I think that's exactly what community work is about. It's about lifting up the flagstone and looking to see what it is we have before we look for the bait in the shop. Now, the challenge in that story is most of us, I think, are told in a consumer society that your good life, it's the conversation we've just had, your good life is in the marketplace. And what you've uncovered is this new story that our good life is in the glow of each other's gifts. And that's one of the things I'm most appreciative to John and to Jody for, because I think they've really emphasized that the way to show up in somebody's life, if you want to make a real difference, is to be curious about their gifts and then to figure out with them how those gifts can get received in the community where they live. And I think one of the challenges we face is that we've got a way of helping that says your best bet if you want to help somebody is to find out what's wrong with them and then figure out a way of fixing that or advising them how to fix that. So I think the whole idea that the Coolin story reminds us of and the We Love Long Beach reminds us of is this idea of starting in a different place. Starting in our place. Not because we want to never use the market's useful for some things, but because we know if we start locally and we start in our place, then we don't get lost. And this is something I think that is really helpful to remind ourselves. When we start in our place, and we'll talk more about this later on, I think we discover that there is an abundance of gifts just waiting to be discovered. And one of the challenges is if you spend your time, as a lot of people who are paid to be helping other people do, delivering services, it's very hard to go into discovery mode. Now, one of the other stories I wanted to share with you briefly today is a story about how asset-based community development started. And it started, as some of you will know, here in North America, so in the US and Canada. In the late 80s, John and Jody, the two men you saw in the picture, they traveled to about 300 neighborhoods across North America. And essentially what they did was they asked people a question. And the question that they asked was, could you tell me a story about a time that you and your neighbors came together to make things better. Simple as that. Now, we all know there's two ways of knowing things, right? One is studies, and the other is stories. Studies give us lots of data. But what stories do, I think, is they enable us to think about how we can create a culture of community. So if you're interested in a social movement, I think I would go with stories rather than studies. So John and Jody, over a 4-year period, gathered about 3,000 stories. And when they sat down to try to understand what these stories were telling us, what was common in these stories, what they noticed was these 6 building blocks kept recurring. So when people told the story, what they were saying here is, this is what we use to hatch community. This is what's used in Coolin. This is what's used in Long Beach. This is what is used everywhere, that community is built from inside out. The gifts of local residents, their passions, their skills. Local associations, the clubs, the groups. And we'll talk more about this later on, but my dad is a member of an association called the Fat Man's Pie Walk. So he had a heart condition a number of years ago and realized he had to do something to address that. So he had open heart surgery, it went well, and he thought, I need to lose some weight. But there's a balance to this. He didn't want to go crazy. So he hung around with a group of guys who like to drink Guinness and have pies on a Sunday morning. So they hatched a plan. They had a vision for themselves. And the plan was that after they were people of faith, so after they would go to Mass, they would go to the pub. But before they would go inside, they would have a 5-mile walk, which was kind of like a circuitous walk. So it would start outside the pub and it would end outside the pub. Well, actually, it would end inside the pub, where they would go and they'd have a pie and a pint. Hence the name, the Fat Man's Pie Walk. But that group has done more. They don't have a constitution or a secretary, but they've done more to build community than any group I've seen in our neighborhood. Because they've done things like get older men who are interested in repairing things together to create repair cafes. They have talked with people who were a bit tricky. I don't know if you have this experience in Long Beach, where there are certain community centers where one person has the key and they only let their friends in. I'm sure that would never happen here. But these guys are really good at talking with people like that and saying, you know what, maybe this is a community asset and maybe we should let other people in. And so associational life, which is the second thing, the power of local associations, was another thing that people mentioned. They also talked about institutions that were helpful to them, that didn't act like fortress walls that people had to climb over, but were really looking to organize themselves the way people organize their lives. I want to honor the college. You've given this space over, so that we can have a community conversation. I love that. Imagine what would happen if in every doctor's surgery, where sick people who are languishing, feeling sick, I guess, or maybe not, 20% of them are not biomedically ill, they're lonely. But because there's no community to go to, they go to the doctor. And the doctor wants to help, so often he medicalizes them. But imagine if the doctor said, I think we've got this space called a waiting room. Let's make it a community meeting room. Now, it might upset some sick people, but who knows? It may also liberate the ones who are not sick and give them some opportunity. They might even join in the conversation. And so I think what you've done is terrific today. You've given us a space here to have a community conversation. And in every community that we've seen getting stronger, what we're seeing is institutions organizing themselves the way community is organized, instead of expecting individuals to organize themselves the way the institution is organized. So we'll talk a lot more about these assets as the afternoon goes on. But I want to move on and tell another story or two in a few minutes. First, though, I'd love you just to have a very quick check-in with each other. And my question for you this time is, what has struck you about what you've heard so far? So let's take 5 minutes to just check in with each other and play with that question. What struck you about what you've heard so far. We'll do a little bit of this in the afternoon, probably in much smaller groups. And Jeff will be helping me out at different stages as well, so that we can get really deep into the conversations, and they'll be a little bit longer. But I'd love to just hear from whoever is moved to share just some reflections on what is striking you at the moment. I think if we hear from 3 or 4 people, it'll probably capture what others are feeling as well. So anybody like to share what has struck them so far? Monica.
I'll just say, just hatching it from the inside out and using people's gifts and skills to really build upon that, I think is really important. I live outside of this city. I'm visiting your city because I love what you guys have done here. And I live in Aliso Viejo, which is in South County, and it's very regimented, and we have all these rules and associations, and you can only paint your house certain colors, and all those kinds of things. But we pay to have all these associations, but we don't have anything that connects the people and builds the unity.
Right.
So I just love what you're saying about using people and stories to build something.
Great, thank you. It's great you're here. Thank you.
Most of us started wanting to connect with people because we had a particular need. There was either needs to connect children with other children, or needs that you're living alone and you want to connect with people. So it started with a need, but there was enough of a need to reach out and touch people.
Yeah,
and try to find some common.
Yeah, yeah.
Need to connect.
Yeah. And I need to connect. And what's interesting, Darlene, is that it may have started with a sense of a need or a sense of a problem you wanted to solve, but what you built the solution on were the gifts and the strengths in your community. And that's beautiful. Thank you. Anybody else? Please.
I just wanted to say, I think at our table we talk a lot about individual strengths and the sort of these individual assets that everybody's bringing, and then sort of building on that, like recognizing that we all have things that we're bringing to a community, wherever that community is defined. And I just wanted to say, just as a reflection, I love this feeling. I just have this real general feeling from all of our discussion about like it's catalytic, right? Like there's like an energy that I really feel so lucky to be around today, that I think people are like really excited to do something and try something and take and share their gift and all that. So I'm
Wow.
really excited.
That's lovely to hear. It really is. And it's, yeah, that's great. That's what you would hope for, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Transformative conversation. So thank you, and thank you all for showing up. So, please.
Well, what struck me was that I agree with everything. And for my own community, I can see how, to go back and explore assets. But for my work, when I am coming from the institutional perspective, how do I bring these ideas or support these ideas or help people to kind of, come out of the eggshell or
Yes,
flip over
yeah,
the flags,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
how do I,
Yeah.
what is my role, or how can
Beautiful.
I do that?
Did everybody hear that question? Yeah, I think it's a powerful question, and I want, thank you for asking it, because I'm sure there are a number of people here who may be primarily interested in how do I show up in my neighbor's life, and I think that's everybody actually. Whether we're thinking about a professional role or not, we all come from neighborhoods, we all have neighbors. But then that question about, if I am paid to be a support, if I'm paid to serve, how do I show up in people's lives in a way that honors their gifts, even though what I might be paid to do, in fact, is to just identify the needs and link them in with services. So how might I work differently or work within that space in a much more intentional way? It's a great question, and it is a question we're going to address. I'll pick it up a little bit in the keynote address as we go forward, but I think we'll get into a lot more detail around that. And I suppose as well, how do you build collaborative relationships, which honor the fact that there's certain things only community can do, and if they don't do them, they won't get done, okay? There's certain things the community can do with a little bit of help from outside. That's where the collaboration comes in, I guess. And then there's certain things that need to be done by agencies in a transparent way, you know. There aren't too many neighborhoods that I know about who want to take the sewer system, the sewerage system in charge, or govern the waste management process. Some do. You know, it's just so bad. I've worked in some areas like in Kibera, which is a slum in Nairobi, where that's what they're actually doing. They've taken the waste management in charge and they're converting it. But these are very particular circumstances. So I think that's a great question. Thank you. Any other reflections before I go on? How do you guys, where did your conversation take? Anybody care to report out?
We love
Ryan.
the beauty of the simplicity of the ideas, and it doesn't need to be this thing where, you know, it's meeting after meeting or what are we going to do, that you can just start and do something simple.
Great, great. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Any table we didn't hear from? We hear from? What are your reflections? Anybody from this table? You're all looking at each other. I'm just checking in. It's not meant to be hardship, Judy. But
just the fact that like it's about making connections and building off of those connections to actually make a difference. So you may think that, you know, just a few people together is not doing much of a difference, but that's just how it starts and how it begins to build, get bigger.
yeah, absolutely. So, you know, what's really powerful, I think, about this is that the wisdom is in the room. And it always is, if we take time to have the conversations that allow that wisdom to be liberated, to be connected, and to be mobilized. You know, I love your point around, you know, that sense of, I feel like I want to do something with these people. I think that's a really, really important marker. You know, I've been, and I'm sure you've been, in many conversations where you think, God, that was a great conversation. You feel intellectually stimulated. You think, God, I'm thinking differently now. But I'm not actually going to do anything with these people. But this idea that we could be in conversation with each other, and that conversation can help us to be more productive, you know. So we're not consumers now, we're producers. We're, you know, the idea that you're in the middle of a keynote address is not an idea that I would entertain anymore. We're in the middle of a backyard revolution. And your only challenge is to stay in trouble and have fun and do stuff together. Because there's a need, right? If we don't do it, it won't get done. But it's simple. You don't need a degree to do this. So if you breathe, you're in. There is nobody's gift that we don't need. So everybody who's been labeled as a problem or as deficient or as defective, which is to say they've been labeled, they've been defined out of the neighborhood and they've been defined into service land, part of our job now is to break them out and bring them back, because we cannot do without their gifts. That's the great message. You have a gift to give, and we cannot do without it. So where have you been all my life? And how did I ever think I could live without you? That's the conversation. And it might sound to the untrained ear, or the uninitiated ear, because we're all implicated now, we're all initiated in some way, it might sound strange, but I don't think it is actually. And I want to share a couple of reasons why I don't think it's strange at all. So, how many people remember well, you may or may not remember this, but how many people remember reports of a heat wave that took place in August of 2003 across Europe? Just a show of hands. Okay. How many people here remember the reports about Hurricane Katrina? Show of hands. So in Hurricane Katrina, tragically, 1,836 people perished directly as a result. During the heat wave, and I'm not trying to draw comparisons for any other reason but that I think it's interesting that so few people know about the heat wave in Europe. But during the heat wave, over a 2-week period, 70,000 people perished as a direct result of that heat wave. Now, we know that heat waves are in fact going to be the great killers of the future. But that's an aside. That's a deficit kind of, just an interesting fact. A worrying fact, but an interesting fact. A need, if you like, right? Our environment needs us to pay a lot more attention. So it's coming to tell us something here, you know. And during that 2-week period, the place, and I think this is interesting, Disa, for your question, okay, because the place where most people died was Paris. France, across the whole country, 15,000 people died during that period. But in Paris, 5,000 died. Now, what's interesting about this is, you know, France, I think, is very proud of its healthcare system. They would say that they have one of the best healthcare systems in the world. And yet, more people died in France and in Paris than in any other part of Europe. And universities have spent, goodness me, maybe 10 or more years trying to figure this out. What went wrong? What happened? What was the failure? So after everything became, you know, apparent and so many people had died, what they started to do, the public and the politicians started to say, this is a failure of the healthcare system. The professionals should have been on guard. They should have seen this coming. They should have done something about this. But what started to happen as the studies came in and the data came in was, in fact, it was only partially true to say that it was a failure of the professional world. That in fact, what it was a failure of community. Most of the 5,000 people who died were women living alone over the age of 65 in poor urban housing. So, and this is true, by the way, I think, of anywhere. In those circumstances, these people died of loneliness in a sea of neighborliness that hadn't been animated yet. Now, when you think about that, and you think about the significance of what you're doing really is the difference between life and death. And I don't mean to be catastrophic or dramatic here, but as a way of trying to lift up the value of what you're doing, because I think sometimes it feels woolly to people who watch on, and maybe even to funders. You know, it's nice to talk to your neighbor, and if you've got time, it's a good thing to do. But it's not of any great consequence, I think most people. That's the story they tell themselves. And yet it is of profound consequence. It's just we don't measure that stuff. And I think that's no bad thing either. Because in fact, what you do shouldn't be measured. It should be treasured. And so I think that if we think about our work, our community work, which is unpaid, it's priceless. It is absolutely priceless. And most of the time, we don't see the value of it. But I keep thinking also of all of the people who've lived life, maybe getting lots of services and getting lots of programs and being helped in all kinds of ways, serviced, if you like, by salaried strangers. And the thing that saddens me is that those same people are walking around with gifts, skills, and passions that they've never, ever been able to share with another human being. So my original training was as a clinical psychologist, and my job was to find a problem and fix it, you know. And if I couldn't find the problem in the biography of the person, it was okay, because I could go back several generations, and I guarantee you I would find one there. So the person would come in with one problem, which typically wasn't the problem that they really had, and I'd do my job, and they'd leave with 100. And I think, God, I'm feeling really messed up, but at least I know why. And I think one of the things that I began to realize was what I was doing was I was addressing their needs in a very particular way. I was addressing their needs as a salaried stranger. But when you try to address somebody's need as a near neighbor, it's completely different. It's completely different. And so I think that's another feature of what you're doing and what maybe wasn't happening in Paris in those neighborhoods. That near neighbors were figuring out how they could be the first line, the first responders to a natural disaster. Anybody who spent any time in a natural disaster knows that, and I have utter respect for our first responders and our uniformed officers and so forth. I'm not making a commentary against them at all. I salute them. But the first responders, who are they? They're neighbors. So I think this is important because what this does is it wakes us up to the value and the importance of what we're doing. And this, by the way, is all evidential. So if we've got funders in our cities, and we've got local government in our cities, and we've got police in our cities, and they don't understand this, then you need to school them. Because it's a matter of life or death. And I think, I'm not sure where I should stand for this. By the way, this is an illustration of the limits of technology. Okay? We use PowerPoint, but in fact the power is here and we're getting to the point. We don't need this anymore. But you look at what the folks here are doing. I think what they're doing is they're refusing to be relegated to the position of a client who is serviced in a system, or an advisor who says, here's how you should organize your program to meet that person's need. And instead, what I think we're seeing here, and in Coolin and different parts of the world, is people who are really thinking about how can we be citizens together. Now, this is very interesting to my mind, and I would not assume to give anybody a history lesson about your own, country. But one of the things I find fascinating is that in 2010, they did a lithnographic study of the original parchments on which your Constitution was written. And when they studied the parchments, what they discovered was that there was a word that was scrubbed out. I mean, these were old parchments, so it was scrubbed out, I think about 100 times. And that word was subject. And you know what word replaced the word subject? Citizen. Because a subject, remember, many of these people were kind of, contrarians who were leaving Europe mainly. They had an axe to grind. They had very strong opinions, and they didn't want a demagogue. Let's not go there. It's St. Patrick's Day. They replaced the word subject, which means to have an allegiance, either by choice or by force, to a king or a queen, a monarch. That's what subject means. You are subject to. And they replaced it with the word citizen. And I think a citizen is somebody who has an allegiance to other citizens. It's another word for neighbor. I do a lot of work in Singapore. And in Singapore, they don't use the word citizen, and democracy is not something we talk a lot about, for obvious reasons, right? So one of the things that I often say when I first come to be in relationship with folks, in a workshop is, what word do you have here in, Singapore is the combination of folks from Malaysia, Indonesia, China, and India. But I'd often say, do you have a word that describes how people come together without any calculation of return, in terms of what they give each other? And they said, yes, every time. They said the word we use for that it's two words. It's gotong royong, which literally means to give to your neighbor with no calculation of return. And so, I stopped using the word citizen, and just when I get off the plane, it's gotong royong. Because in every culture, we have a way of describing how to be in relationship with people that's not monetized. And that's the third way. So we have citizen, we have subject, and then the third way is consumer. So I think what you are is your citizens who have an allegiance to each other, who sometimes consume, because we all do. We consumed a flight yesterday. I was quite happy that it wasn't run by community folks. Imagine how disastrous that might be. You know, there's kind of a very egalitarian community development pilot says, you know what, I've got lots of buttons here, but you know, I would like you to have a discussion and you tell me which one I should press. You know, not the way to go. So we need services. But one of the things I really want to pay attention to and figure out over these next couple of days together, and I hope you can all join us, okay? Because I think we've kind of connected with each other now. So I hope that it's possible that we can stay together. And even if you haven't planned, it's always good to get out of plan mode and go into search mode, okay? So just be a little bit disruptive and take a risk. Who knows? I mean, if you've got kids that need to be minded, you know, bring them with you. We can do that, right? Yeah? Okay. We can figure it out. We can figure it out. Scott's having palpitations back there. Call a doctor. No, but we'll figure it out. We want you are welcome. We want to host this conversation, and if it's possible, we'd love you all to be with us. Because I think what we're trying to do here is we're trying to produce something, you know, a set of ideas, but also a set of commitments and promises around what we're going to do next. So, we're coming near the end of my time, and we're going to make sure that we honor the break at 11. But a couple of maybe just remarks. I want to pick up on the question, the wonderful question around how do we, as maybe paid professionals, really come in a relationship with people and come alongside people in a way that honors their agency. I think that's So I wanted to tell you two stories, okay? And then I'll have some concluding remarks, and I'd love to hear your thoughts or questions. The first story comes from the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle. Can you see this? Yep. So this is a bridge, if you like, that runs through Fremont, and it was causing an awful lot of challenges locally in the community. So a lot of antisocial behavior, drug dealing, you know. So a lot of activity that was not pro-community was going on there. And I think typically what happens when, you know, there's an issue like that is people often mobilize to complain about the problem, you know. So we go to the city or we go to the police department and we say, you know, we've got an issue here. The engineering department maybe tries to do something with that builds fencing or whatever, or the policing department try and do something to police the problem out. But in Fremont, the local government, Seattle local government said, well, how about we go at this a completely different way? And this is the great vision of Jim Deers, who's actually a colleague of ours. But when he was the director of the Department of Neighborhoods, I love this, that the city actually organized one department that looks like community. It's called the Department of Neighborhoods, right? Not the Department of Waste Management or the Department of Engineering, but the Department of Neighborhoods. And that became the clearinghouse for all of the activities, you know, the different things, because we need silos, we need waste to be looked after, but they had one place that was organized the way we organize ourselves. And so the Department of Neighborhoods said, well, how about you think yourselves about what it is you have locally and how you would like to use that to solve a problem, hatch a problem from inside out. And so there were lots of discussions. I mean, Fremont is quite an artsy kind of neighborhood, so there were lots and lots of ideas. And what the city said they would do is they had just introduced a matching fund scheme. So this is where the city says to people, you know what, instead of doing top-down granting where we set the criteria and if you fit it, you can have the money, but you're going to have to compete with your neighbors, and if you get it, they don't, which is a pretty awful way to do community, I think. You know, it's a guaranteed way to damage community. It's pit everybody against each other for a small amount of funding, okay? So what they said is, how about instead, you know, they were going through tough times when this happened, so they had very little in their budget, but they said, how about instead of just thinking about resource in money terms, we honor the fact that in every neighborhood there's sweat equity. You know, there's voluntary time, there's commitment, there's passion. And how about instead of us setting a criteria, if every time you and your neighbors, 3 or 4 of you, come together and want to do something, we recognize the value of that. And again, they're an institution, so sometimes they value things in money, but we recognize that as having value. So perhaps if we do something like, say, every hour that you put into trying to make your community a better place is valued at $15 an hour. So if you do need some resource, it's not a charitable grant. I'm not granting you anything, I'm matching. It's a collaborative exercise. It just so happens we've got different currencies. You've got social capital, we've got fiscal capital. And actually, social capital matters more in Seattle. So what they were trying to do there was use money in a way that didn't damage social capital, but actually drew it out. Almost like hovering a magnet over a neighborhood and attracting anybody with metal in their belly out. You see? And so one of the initiatives that emerged from this was the solution to this antisocial behavior under the bridge. Long story short, after much discussion, and in fact a fair where people voted on different ideas, the idea that the folks came up with was to put a troll under the bridge. Why is this not working? Let me just go over here actually. It's the big reveal. Do you see? Now that's a life-size VW in the claws of the troll, just to give you a sense. And it attracts people from all over the world. This is the interesting thing. When community solutions emerge, they don't just solve one problem. They solve multiple problems. So this is one of the biggest tourist attractions. So it's not just a way of producing safety, it attracts people from all over the world. And here's proof. So Peter Block, a colleague of Jeff's and mine, says, it's a misuse of our power to take responsibility for solving problems that belong to other people. I don't think we often think about this, but the idea of taking somebody's problem is an act of robbery. That problems, or more to the point, possibilities, are the great way that we come together. Darlene was saying earlier on, the kids need a village. It takes a village to raise a child, so we got to make a village. We don't have a youth problem, we have a village problem. And so how do we do something about the village? Possibility. It's always nice to shift from the problem to the possibility because you get more people in the conversation and the energy grows. So I want to finish because I'd love to hear your thoughts and your questions as we go to 11 o'clock. And I think I can finish by saying that there are three things that we've been talking about this last hour and 45 minutes. And the first thing is that I think if we want to grow a community where everybody's gifts are revealed and received, I think we would really pay attention to connection. And we would be very, very, very thoughtful about the impulse to conversion. I wonder whether we spend far too much time trying to convert people to our agendas or our ideas or our service. And I think we may do that not just as paid professionals, but also as well-intended neighbors. But I think when we're building connection, what we're doing is building empathy, not sympathy. And I'm really, really cautious about sympathy. Because sympathy puts one person in the role of the helper and the other in the role of the helped. And the helper doesn't need anything from the helped. And that's not community. So I think what we're talking about is collective empathy. So this idea that we start with connection, not conversion. I think the second idea is that we're starting with discovery, not delivery. They're very connected, those 2 points. But because so many people, when we go to work, if we're doing community development or we're doing local government, we're in the delivery business, right? I mean, it's interesting to think about the Fremont story. Can you imagine a department of engineering ever coming up with an idea like they came up with in the community? Imagine sitting with the drawings and thinking, Adam, I've got this perfect idea. I think what we should do is put a troll under the bridge. That's the way to go. Let's use city money to do that. It's not going to happen. But because Seattle, and Jim Deers in particular, were in discovery mode, they were really trying to understand what's in this place and what do people care about enough to act upon in this place, and then how can we support that activity. Those ideas emerge. And it's really hard today to go into any neighborhood in Seattle and not see examples of this. So if you're here today from the city or from the police department, consider this. In every single professional domain, whether it's producing health or safety or better local environments, there are things that citizens can do that cannot be done by the professional world. And this is really critical. And the only way to discover this is to start, and it's the third thought, start with what's strong, not with what's wrong. And then use what's strong to address what's wrong and make what's strong even stronger still. You know, in the final analysis, what I love most about this work is that people who've been traditionally defined as the problem, when they secure the power to redefine the problem, everything changes. And that's the possibility that you're creating. So I'm honored, as is Jeff, to be with you today, to learn from you and to learn with you. And I'm looking forward to an afternoon of very, very interesting and much more intimate conversations where I do less speaking like this and we do more listening to each other. But I thank you very much for listening today. Thank you. So, do we have a moment or two that we could give people a chance to ask questions? Do we have that time? So, yeah, maybe take a few minutes. Yeah. I mean, remembering we have this afternoon, but you know, if you're feeling moved to ask a question, just go with it. And if you could say who you are if you haven't already. I think one of the most beautiful things in life is when people come to their senses. And one of the ways of doing that is through art. Art is a way of knowing that's not about logic and about science. It's a way of standing in the magical face of mystery and not trying to run away. Just really being present. So I think there are very, very few other ways of building community that I know that are more impactful. So for me, I think, in a way, what I want to do in answer to your question is to cheer you on and to validate your voice for what it's worth. And I thank you for your compliment to me. But, you know, you're doing it. Your work matters. And what you're doing, it doesn't... You know, one of the things that really saddens my heart is when I see people think the only reason something is of value is if you can scale it up. So there's lots of funders who'll say, it's okay, but it's too small. How do we scale this up? Or I really like this. I want to bring this across all of Long Beach. I would encourage people to resist that very, very strongly. Because what you're doing just reminds us again of that great, great call to change, which is that small is beautiful. So good on you. Keep doing what you do. Ryan.
I could use any suggestions or stories about kind of a way to grease your first impression, to bring an aura of community building and fun and an invitation and not setting off violation of privacy, violation of safety, just kind of any tips, pointers.
Yeah.
I realized when I was doing a Long Beach breakfast, definitely don't go door to door when the sun's down. That really creeps people out. I learned, but any other ideas or stories of ways to engage people creatively that doesn't trigger their...
Well, you see, I think they're the kinds of questions that we need to be getting into and workshopping. But my holding thought is, I love that detail, because I think you could say something like, go find connectors. So you read an ABCD book, it says you got to find connectors, don't look for the leaders, and we'll talk about this. Well, one of my all-time favorite things to do during daylight hours is to get to know the names of all of the dogs, right? And this is a really important sequence. You got to get to know the names of the dogs first. That's your way into getting to know the names of the dog walkers. And you can go for weeks and weeks, actually, if the dog's name is Molly, referring to the dog owner as Molly's dad or Molly's mom. But there's something really powerful in the trust building, process about actually getting to know those people and walking with them. Ideally, if you have a dog, that helps. Well, there you go. So it seems to me, that in every community, it's a bit like what a carpenter would do. So what a carpenter does before they do anything to the wood is they will check for the grain. And I think we also need to find the grain in our communities, in our neighborhoods. Where are people already celebrating? Where are people already connecting? Where are people already producing art? Who are the people who don't creep out their neighbors and just seem to do this naturally? So I think that whole process of finding the rhythm, I say it again, the rhythm of your community, that's your starting point. And staying away from fixing, going into discovery mode, being curious, not helpful. That's, which is what you were doing. You go, oh, okay, that's feedback. They don't like it when it's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Ryan. Okay, I'm going to suggest that for now, we take a break. And I'm looking forward to reconnecting with everybody, as is Jeff in the afternoon. But for now, Christine, I think you're going to close us out.
I just want to join me in welcoming and thanking Cormac for his time.
Thank you.
Cormac has done a wonderful job in modeling exactly what he's showing and bringing to us in unearthing the gifts that are in the room. He reminded us that the wisdom is in the room. And so I really encourage you, if you're able to stay in the room and join us for the workshop this afternoon as well as tomorrow. I encourage you to. Any time you can spend here, we appreciate it, but especially the last 2 hours, we really are grateful for everyone. I know, actually, I sense that people are taking things from today that are going to kind of grow, and they're like little seedlings that are going to show up in other areas of your life as you think about what was spoken today. So thank you, Cormac. I appreciate you so much. We're going to take a break, but I don't think we're in any huge hurry to get out of the room if you want to mingle a little bit.
Could we